Well, thank you for the privilege of being here. It's really exciting. Appreciate your time. You could have been doing a whole range of different things today, but you've chosen to be here. And thank you too for Peter for being here. As someone who's influenced my life in ministry, I'm incredibly nervous, Peter, but it's great to have you here. Bit about me, my whakapapa. This is my mother, my sister and my brother. We whakapapa back to a woman called Wharetutu Newton. And Wharetutu married a sailor in the 1820s on an island called Codfish Island, which is a couple of kilometres off Stewart Island. And then our family in the 1900s moves to Te Arawa, where my mother still lives beside our marae in Maratā. As you can see, this is a very old photo, but my brother is often compared to John Olomu. And my sister is about as white as a Pākehā baby's bottom. And me, I kind of go up and down depending whether it's summer or winter. But my uncle Leith Comer had the privilege of serving as CEO of Te Pune Kōkiri and finished about a year or two ago. So over the last 20 years, my mother essentially raised us in a Pākehā context. My father was of Scottish descent, but over the last 20 years, been through a process of discovering and appreciating both my Scottish heritage and my Māori heritage. My mother's been on the same journey. She lives across from our marae and is learning the ways of the marae in Maratā. I'm married to Emma. Emma's a paediatric physiotherapist. We have 3 children, Hannah, who's now 13, Benjamin 11 and Zoe 6, and we tell each of our children that they're 100% Māori and 100% Pākehā, and it's an immense privilege to be both in this time in New Zealand's history. But I'd like to take you to the morning of February the 6th. It's 5 a.m. and we're at the dawn service at Waitangi. In the photo are leaders, political leaders. Across from them are leaders of Ngā Pui, and here are leaders of the armed service. The leader of the opposition and then the Prime Minister is given a prayer, giving thanks to the Christian God. A Ngāti Parau leader is asked to sing a waiata, and she sings, "Your love, O Lord, reaches to the heavens." And on this, our National Day, at the prayer service that begins the events of Waitangi Day, the role and influence of Jesus of Nazareth is quite significant. And I've been wrestling with the question, as I've read Claudia Orange and a whole range of historians, how was it that a first century crucified Jew, who himself was crucified under colonising Roman power, has come to have such an influence across our founding document? The earliest credible accounts of Jesus' followers attest that post his death they believed 2 things. One, they believed that he had returned from the dead, and 2, they believed that Jesus of Nazareth was the God of Israel. This belief is deeply offensive to ancient observant Jews, and it's still offensive to Jews today, practicing Jews today. But so radically held was it that the belief in Jesus' deity and resurrection radically grew. And it grew and grew and grew and impacted the Roman Empire. And by 380, the Roman Empire begins to make some form of Christianity, the state religion. And by the year 600, that message spreads out to the United Kingdom, and over the next 1,000 years would spread across Europe. And now in the 1800s, the British Empire has become the world's leading power, controlling 1/4 of the world's population and 1/5 of the total land area. And it encourages global trade. But 30 years before the explosive growth of the British Empire, Christian traders, merchants, and evangelical followers of Jesus meet to discuss how they can grow the common good across the empire in the name of this Jesus. And this group would include William Wilberforce, the Reverend John Newton, the famous ex-slave trader and hymn writer. This group would later form the Church Missionary Society in 1799. And in 1794, William Wilberforce encourages a young Samuel Marsden, out of care for Indigenous people and the English people settling Australia and New Zealand, to take up a chaplaincy role in Sydney. And it's here that Marsden comes into relationship with Māori men and women. And it's here he begins to grow a passion to see Māori men and women encounter this Jesus of Nazareth. Out of a passion for Māori, he goes back to London in 1808 to advocate for a mission. And with the blessing of the CMS, gets the approval and some of the resources to begin a mission in New Zealand. On his voyage back to Australia from London in 1808, Marsden comes across Ruatara, who's already previously been in Australia, and he encounters him on board a ship. Ruatara has been dealt with harshly by the ship's captain and is not in good health. Both on the voyage, Marsden begins to nurse him, takes him back to Parramatta, sees him come back to health, and over a number of years shows Ruatara different farming practices, etc., etc. And Ruatara develops an interest, an economic interest, a social interest, and a spiritual interest to see something of what he's been taught by Marsden introduced to his own people. He has reservations. There are reservations. And in in 1811, before returning to New Zealand, Ruatara begins expressing that he would like a mission to be established amongst his people. And the roll-on effect is, in November 1814, Marsden, accompanied by 34 other passengers, set sail for New Zealand. He's accompanied by the early missionaries, Kendall, Hall and King, accompanied by their wives and children, 8 Māori, including Ruatara, Hongi, 2 Tahitians, 4 sailors, Captain Thomas Hampson, his wife and son, and John Nichols, 2 sawyers, 1 smith, and 1 runaway convict. And it's here, at the invitation of Ruatara, that Samuel Marsden holds the first formal Christian service on Christmas morning at the base of Rangahau Pa. The message of this crucified Jew, Jesus of Nazareth, has travelled the 16,111 kilometres from Jerusalem to Oihi Bay. It's taken about 1,780 years to arrive here. And the occasion itself on Christmas morning, 1814, is marked by 2 significant firsts. It marks the generous and courageous hospitality of Ruatara. Ruatara is the first Māori chief to enable the missionaries to live amongst his people. The service takes place at Ohihi Bay in the Bay of Islands. It's a stone's throw from the pa up on the hill, which is at the time home to about 200 Māori. The service is attended by Māori chiefs from across the region. On shore, about 400 Māori participate in the service. Samuel Marsden speaks famously from Luke chapter 2, and Ruatara translates something of that. What is said and what is translated is lost to history, but there has been some work by Alan Davidson and others, which can be found online. I think it's now in a book, about both what Marsden may have said and what may have been translated. But it is deeply encouraging that the first formal Protestant Christian service in New Zealand is a bicultural, bilingual affair. Dr. Alan Davidson writes, the engagement between Ruatara and Marsden, iwi and tā iwi, Māori and missionaries, inaugurates the missionary starting point here at Rangahua Pa. And he says this is a foundational event in New Zealand's history. It ranks alongside the encounters between Māori and Abel Tasman in 1642 and Māori and James Cook in 1769, and the signing of the treaty between Māori and the British Crown at Waitangi in 1840. But can I ask you why Dr. Davidson would consider it such a significant event? Such a pivotal and seminal event in the history of New Zealand. He argues this. In the months following the first service at Ohihi Bay, the missionaries begin to establish their homes in the mission station at the base of the pa. And it's here, he argues, that the first substantial beginnings of our bicultural journey actually begin. Dr. Alan Davidson suggests this is the first kind of formal, permanent bicultural settlement in New Zealand. It's here that the missionary families established the first permanent Pākehā settlement in New Zealand. It's here that the first European-style homes are built. It's here that the first Pākehā school is established. I look out in the Manawatu on a 400-acre paddock, and I'm constantly reminded that it's actually here that sheep farming begins in New Zealand. It's here that the first Pākehā child would be born in New Zealand. It would be here in this bicultural settlement that Pākehā would first begin to study the Māori language. It is here that the Māori language is first begun to be committed to writing. It would be here that our first orchards and apples and pears are established. Just a wee aside. There is a ranger for the far north that his sole role is to preserve our historic flora and fauna. And for the bicentenary, he propagated lemon trees, cuttings from lemon trees that were first planted by the missionaries. And at the bicentenary commemorations with the Governor General, he gave us a Marsden cutting. It's such a privilege to have, and there may be others that you can access. Chat to me afterwards. Now I've lost my spot. But these are difficult years for both Māori and missionary across the settlement. The bicultural journey for both tribe and mission station will be often characterised by confusion and apprehension. But the firsts continue into the next generation. In 1819, the CMS missionary John Butler introduces into New Zealand the first plough. In September 1825, Christian Rangi is the first Māori baptised. And it would be from here that chiefs and slave owners would begin to hear something of the message of this Jesus of Nazareth. And in encountering that message, free slaves who would make their way back down these islands with that message of Jesus. And so I want to suggest, I'm kind of laying a foundation. We're getting to the treaty. But it's almost like the treaty is actually midwifed here. And it's here, at the site of the Marsden Cross at Ohihi Bay, that I think bicultural New Zealand gets some momentum. Samuel Carpenter writes, from the 1820s onwards there would be an explosion of Māori engagement with portions of New Testament scriptures, engaging, interpreting, implying, and often uniquely in Māori ways and for Māori purposes. And in this season, over half the Māori population come into some form of engagement with the message of Jesus of Nazareth from the New Testament. And it's within this foundation, and it's for these reasons, that the message of this Jesus of Nazareth comes to imprint itself in so many unique ways on the Treaty of Waitangi. Why do I say that? I'm going to give 4 reasons. And the first one's this. The message of Jesus contributes to the motivation for the treaty in the UK. In the years leading up to the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, most of the 25 staff at the British Colonial Office are members of William Wilberforce's Clapham sect community. This is a wide-ranging group of influential friends who include the Colonial Secretary himself, Lord Clenagh. That's not him, by the way. And Jesus' vision of humanity's equality and God's justice has caught these people, has got these people, and has shaped these people. And out of that shaping, they campaign tirelessly and passionately within the UK parliamentary system for the rights of Indigenous peoples and against slavery. And this leads towards their hearts and eyes and concerns turning towards the Māori population of New Zealand. Now I want to recognise, at this time they form only one voice amongst many. In the Parliament there are many competing voices. And I don't want to say, look at these Christian voices, all good, because there are commercial colonisers from equally religious motives who, want to brutally colonise the country. It's just not as simple as Christianity good, colonisers bad. But these competing voices lead the Parliament to recognise that it does need to enter into a treaty with the Māori population. And so Lieutenant Governor William Hobson is therefore dispatched from Sydney in January 1840 to achieve that end. Here's point 2. This message of Jesus shapes the content of the treaty. James Stephen is the permanent Under-Secretary in the Colonial Office. He is possibly the most influential civil servant in his generation. And again, he's a man who's profoundly shaped by the message of Jesus. And as a follower of Jesus, his convictions lead him to a deep conviction and passion for the abolition of slavery, championed by his brother-in-law William Wilberforce and others. And he later becomes deeply concerned about the negative impact of colonisation. Wanting to avoid a similar pattern in New Zealand, he drafts instructions for Lord Normandy, which are given to William Hobson when he is sent to New Zealand in 1840. Part of the instructions are as follows. All dealings with Māori must be conducted with sincerity, justice and good faith. They must not be permitted to enter into any contracts in which they may be ignorant or injurious to themselves. You will not purchase from them any territory that would be essential or highly conducive to their own comfort, safety or sustenance. Can I suggest to you that the content of the treaty, as frail as it is shaped by these instructions? And these instructions are ultimately actually shaped by the life and person of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. Third point, the message of Jesus shapes the nature of the treaty. Missionaries, Claudia Orange argues, had cultivated an image of the Queen as personally loving towards Māori. Henry Williams would affirm to Māori at Waitangi that the treaty was an act of love of love towards them on behalf of the Crown. This thinking led many chiefs who were then, by now, either influenced by the message of Jesus or committed to it, to see the treaty in terms of a spiritual bond, a covenant, a Christian covenant, with all the weight of the biblical covenants. For some of these chiefs, the treaty was a covenant between the Māori people and the Queen as head of the English church and state. Many Māori would call the treaty the covenant of Waitangi for that reason. Many Māori at the time perceived that the treaty enabled Māori and Pākehā to be one people in both a spiritual and societal sense. In affirming this in some way was Hobson's words to each chief as a chief came to put his mark on the treaty documents. Hobson would say, "Haiwi tahi tātou." And I think Professor Peter Lynham has suggested in one of your books that those words may have been given to him from the missionary Henry Williams and are a loose translation of Ephesians chapter 2 verses 13 and 14. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. At the heart of the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi may have been the life and work of Jesus of Nazareth. The northern tribe Ngāpuhi in particular, I think, understood the treaty as a special kind of covenant with the Queen. And before you think that may have been the misguided views of a few, Claudia Orange goes on to talk about the Komaramara Conference in 1860, where 500 chiefs again spend an entire week debating this issue and in some way affirm together the Waitangi Covenant. Claudia Orange also writes, for British officials it's fair to say that any perception of covenant And the missionaries emphasising the humanitarian protection it would bring was simply the price of securing sovereignty. The message of Jesus shapes a motivation for the treaty, the content in the treaty, the nature of the treaty possibly, and possibly then goes on to influence the reception of the treaty. As you know, on February the 6th, 43 chiefs signed the treaty. In all, over the next 8 months, a further 500 will. Claudia Orange suggests that where chiefs had come under the influence of the message of Jesus and the mana of various missionaries, they were more likely to sign, and those who hadn't wouldn't. But that's not the whole story, is it? This covenant would soon be shattered. Almost immediately, the tide of settlers hungry for land begins to rise from 2,000 in 1840 to 13,000 in 1846. Towards the end of the 1850s, Māori and the settler population are approximately 60,000 each. In the 1860s, the New Zealand government in 1880s would enact the most shameful and despicable legislation in our history, which still leaves a deep scar on our consciousness, or it should. Tribes fight for the land, and the result is the New Zealand Settlement Act of 1863. This legislation is so despicable. It enables the government to confiscate the land of tribes who were fighting to save their lands. Millions of acres are confiscated and leave large swathes of tribes landless. The Māori Prisoners Detention Act allows indefinite imprisonment of those who have been fighting, often peacefully, for their land. By 1900, the Māori population has plummeted to 44,000, and a tsunami of settlers is on its way. What kind of mark has the treaty, the abandonment of the treaty left on us as New Zealanders? Native American psychologist Unado Duran suggests that colonial oppression suffered by Indigenous peoples inevitably leaves a wound on the soul. And I can say that I've been on Marae and seen that wound as if it happened yesterday. Watching men and women weep over the loss of everything to them as if it happened yesterday. But I don't think the treaty process has only left a wound in the heart of Māori. In his book Report on Experience in 1947, John Mulligan wrote of New Zealanders, of their propensity for travel and their need to return. He writes, "They come from one of the most beautiful countries in the world, but it is a small and very remote country. After a while, this isolation oppresses them and they go abroad. They are a queer, lost, eccentric, pervading people who seldom admit to the deep desire that is in all of them to go home and live quietly again." You know, that lostness. I think there is a lostness, there is an unsettledness, there is, I think, amongst many younger Pākehā in particular, an unsettledness with the relationship with these islands. And behind that is the recognition of injustice, of the wound that makes up the New Zealand story. And if there's a wound in the wider Māori population and a wound in the Pākehā population, there is a wound in the heart of the church, of followers of Jesus. Again, Dr. Allison writes, "The church was certainly complicit in land alienation in the 19th century, both actively and passively." Where was the church's voice when the legislation was passed in the 1860s, resulting in confiscations? And historians would recognise there were voices, individual voices. But where was the church's collective voice? Where was the church's voice when the native land court was used to wrestle tribal lands away from whole peoples? I'd like to kind of spend the last few minutes talking about how this has impacted me personally. Like his first century followers, in my late teens and adult life, I've come to the conviction that Jesus of Nazareth did rise from the dead. And one of the reasons that I've come to that over a period of time is the explosion of his followers in the first century, of the impact of that message in Rome, across Europe, and across the world. And I've come to the personal conviction that Jesus of Nazareth is not only Israel's God, but he's the God of the whole universe. And that has shaped profoundly my understanding of the treaty and my spirituality in relationship with the Treaty of Waitangi. And here's some of the implications for me and my family. Following this Jesus means that I see life and history through the lens of his death and resurrection. And what does that mean? It means I am not committed to a revisionist history, telling stories through, and I know I do this, by the way, we can't not, but I'm committed to seeing myself doing it, of telling 150-year-old stories through today's standards and values. I'm not committed to hagiography. I'm not committed to telling 150-year-old stories of Christianity or missionaries in ways that are overly sympathetic or bordering on embellishment. Hopefully, seeing that Jesus has died and risen, I'm committed to an epistemology, a way of seeing reality that's called critical realism, of thinking that reality and history is engageable, is knowable, but respecting that I am part of that process and seeing my own frailty in that. As a follower of Jesus, I'm committed to seeking truth and justice. I believe I am not responsible for the church's breaches of the Treaty of Waitangi, but I take deadly seriously my responsibility to understand them. I've learned a lot from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, and it is significant that the truth must come before reconciliation. And I'm not afraid of the truth. Let it land where it lies. But as a follower of Jesus, I am deeply committed to justice. And it has been a privilege over the last 3 years to speak in about 30 or 40 different churches and conferences about followers of Jesus' responsibility to the Treaty of Waitangi. And I believe that there is a new spirit in New Zealand. I believe a new New Zealand is coming of age, and a younger, browner, more multicultural New Zealand is coming. And I've seen a new spirit at Waitangi over these last 3 years, a new tone, a new posture. And I am seeing predominantly large Pākehā congregations and hearing some of this going, we get it. Not that we've got it, but we get our responsibilities. And we get that we're complicit in it, historically, but we get our responsibilities in this generation. We're absolutely scared witless. What does this look like? We have so little Māori in our communities. And it's been a privilege to share of ways of serving iwi. I've suggested to some churches that iwi are halfway through the treaty settlement process. There's a lot of professionals in a lot of churches? Are there ways that you could just go and offer to serve iwi in their settlement process? I've been delighted. People are like, that scares us witless. But we're up for that. Talking about this, I've had older Pākehā come up and just say, Mark, I see that I am a functional racist. What do I need to do? What does it look like? I have no idea. And so I do feel that followers of Jesus are kind of getting the responsibility to be a treaty partner. And then lastly, as a follower of Jesus, for my family and I, we're committed to acting redemptively. What do I mean by that? Partly it means encouraging the good wherever we find it, speaking well of the treaty, saying to people that when the treaty works well, it works well for all New Zealanders, of identifying and surfacing stories of that working well. It feels like that the popular media gives the treaty relationship just all the oxygen around controversies. And it's been a privilege to surface accounts of tribes who have settled and then done something profoundly generous with their settlement. Almost one of the first things they do. And I believe that when we seek to uphold and express the values of the Waitangi Covenant, I believe that it leads us into a deeper experience of what it means to be Māori and Pākehā and Kiwi. Why? Because the treaty, properly understood, affirms our place on the land together. Let me read to you from Chief Judge Eddie Jury's quote in his Waitangi Day address in 1989. We Māori must not forget that the treaty is not just a Bill of Rights for Māori. It is a Bill of Rights for Pākehā too. It is the treaty that gives Pākehā the right to be here. Without the treaty, there would be no lawful authority for the Pākehā presence in this part of the South Pacific. The Pākehā are not like the French in New Caledonia or the Indians in Fiji. Our Prime Minister can stand tall in Pacific and international forums, not in spite of the treaty, but because of it. We must remember that if we are tangata te whenua, the original people, then Pākehā are tangata te reti, those who belong to the land by right of the treaty. You know, I appreciate that there has been an immense amount of legitimate grievance. And I appreciate that the treaty is a frail document. But at the same time, my children are Ngāi Tahu and Te Arawa. And we recognise that Ngāi Tahu has suffered for generations massive land losses. We've done iwi liaison trips back to Codfish Island as a family. And it has over a century of a broken treaty relationship, coupled with the deprivation of a people and the loss of mana. And the recognition by the Crown of that loss has led to the Ngāi Tahu Treaty settlement process. My children have benefited from that settlement in a number of direct ways, as will their children. These things have been such a blessing. And I keep saying to my children, as frail as the treaty was and the process of keeping it was, it's actually that treaty that has enabled you to be blessed and provided for in the way you are today. It is that treaty that has enabled Ngāi Tahu to become the economic powerhouse. It is that treaty that will enable tribes over the next 25 years. I believe this is a pivotal time in New Zealand to the lead up to the bicentenary of the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, and I believe it'll be that treaty and the economic powerhouses that are now kind of starting to develop amongst tribes that as New Zealand ages and the cost of servicing an ageing population increases for the government, and with a younger population, the cost of the tax base, may decrease. It'll be that treaty that'll enable tribes and the government to devolve more authority to tribes, more sovereignty to tribes to provide services out of their own economic base. I think somewhere in the next 25 years there'll be some form of transaction that will return sovereignty to tribal areas, and it'll be because of that treaty. My children I delight in about 98% of the time. Oops, I forgot my slides. And they each have biblical names. Oh, I'll go back to them actually. And I'm just finishing now. They each have biblical names: Hannah, Benjamin, and Zoe. Zoe being the Greek word for life in the New Testament. They do so because this Jesus and his message stands at the centre of our life together. They also have Pākehā names of which we're immensely proud, named after relatives and forebears in New Zealand: Joy, James and May. And it is our hope that they grow up with the character, work ethic and convictions of these men and women. But they also have Māori names, named after our ancestors and tribal leaders: Atarita, Parika and Hinemoa from Rotorua. And it is my hope for my children that they grow up and follow this Jesus. It is my hope that they grow up into a bicultural and multicultural New Zealand where this treaty is honoured, respected, lived out across all society for the good of Māori and all New Zealanders. And may it be so as we come up to the bicentenary of the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi in February 2040. Thank you. I've got a gift for you guys. I've just got to break open the gift box. One of the tertiary organisations that I work for, because of the bicentenary and knowing that the story of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke had a significant impact in New Zealand, did a beautiful New Zealand Kiwi Gospel of Luke. It contains something of the story of Aotearoa, the story of Torori, Māori proverbs and language, New Zealand imagery, and the story of Jesus. And if you'd like one as a gift, you'd be more than welcome to that. But I'd like to open that up for questions. Nothing's off the table. I'm not a world authority, but I'll give you a sincere and genuine answer. And then I'll ask Peter. Please, questions.
Mark, I'll ask you a question which is a bit unfair anyway. Hei i tahe tātou. So, Hobson's words seem to have envisaged, based on Ephesians, I think, a kind of unified one people. But you're not talking of that at all. You're talking, what's the biblical imagery of our kind of bicultural society?
I think, and Peter and I may just use some theological language here. I think the gospel, which is the word for the message of Jesus, both affirms cultures and subverts them. And so I think the message of Jesus affirms my kind of Māori heritage, delights in it, wants to see that amplified. And yet in the call to come together through the message of Jesus, I'm called to both delight in my culture and, in a sense, lovingly, unselfishly, lay something of it down to be us together. And so I feel that imagery and Hobson's quoting from the book of Ephesians, and the book of Ephesians was written by an early church leader within the first century. And I think that call is to delight in our distinctives, but come together in and with and through this message of Jesus. Yeah. Well, I appreciate your time. Thank you for your questions. I have Peter McKenzie has done this is about 6 years old. It's a essay on public Christianity in Te Riti o Waitangi, how the Clapham sect influenced and impacted the treaty, and that may be of value. I think Peter's work, Dr. Alan Davidson put together, there was a historical symposium in 2014 at Ohihi Bay on the early missionary movement, the pluses and minuses of missionary engagement, and I think that was put into a book that's available. Peter, what would be kind of around the spiritual strand, books or...
Yeah, I certainly think that would be a place to start, and that's in the library.
Yep.
And it's called He Iwi Taki Tato, and it's edited by Alan Davidson.
Anything else?
There is also a set of essays. Well, there's a number of sets of
See Peter.
I can give you plenty of references if you want.
Hey, well,
That's not a bad place to start.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time. It's been a real privilege to be here. I'd love you to take a gift if you'd like one. And thanks again. Thanks, Ricky.